I am 36 years old, married for 8 years, and have 2 children. I'm the only son of my father, who's been suffering from kidney issues for several years now. What began as a manageable condition has progressively worsened over the past 2 or 3 years, leading him to require dialysis twice a week. When Dad's health first started declining, he was still able to commute on his own, and he didn't require much assistance. However, over the last year, his condition deteriorated to the point where he could no longer manage the regular trips to the dialysis center by himself. He began asking me to accompany him, and eventually, I took on the responsibility. Dad has always been a proud man, and I could see how much it pained him to rely on others, but I felt that this was something I had to do for him. Despite having a busy life of my own, I decided that I couldn't let him face this alone. To accommodate both my work schedule and my father's needs, I devised a routine. Since I work in an office job, I could take Saturdays off, so it was easy to dedicate the day to driving Dad to dialysis. Wednesdays were more complicated, but I spoke to my boss and got permission to leave work early. I promised to make up the time later, working at night after I returned home from the dialysis center. I've been working at the same company for 10 years, and my boss knows me as a hardworking and loyal employee, so granting me this flexibility wasn't an issue. However, the real problem began when I got home. My wife, Ailing, who is 34, didn't react the way I had hoped when I told her about my new routine. When I used to occasionally take Dad to the center, she hadn't made a big fuss, but now that I had committed to it regularly, things were different. She became upset, expressing her displeasure in no uncertain terms. "What's the point of spending so much time with your father?" she asked. "No matter what you do, he's never going to be impressed by you." I was taken aback by her words. A bit of context here. My father had built a successful merchandising business over the years, amassing considerable wealth. Early on, he made it clear that he wanted me to take over the business. But I had different plans for my life. I was passionate about technology, specifically coding and software development, and I didn't want to follow in his footsteps. My decision to pursue a software degree instead of business or management was met with disappointment, but he tolerated it. Still, when I graduated, I decided to join a tech company rather than his business, and that was when the tension really began to mount between us. Dad kept pushing me to take over the business. His dream was for me to continue what he had started, to carry his legacy forward. But I was firm in my resolve. I wanted to build my own path, and joining his company was never something I wanted to do. This created a rift between us. Even after I got married and had children, he continued to ask me to reconsider. But I refused, insisting that I didn't need his money or his business to be successful. I was earning well on my own, had bought my own car and house by the time I was 29, and felt secure in my ability to provide for myself and my family. This hurt my father deeply. He became more distant, especially after my mother passed away 5 years ago from a sudden cardiac arrest. Losing her was devastating for him, and it strained our already fragile relationship. However, after her death, something changed. I began visiting him more often, realizing that he was now completely alone. I'd been living on my own since I was 17, and while I had always kept in touch with my parents, the passing of Mom made me appreciate my dad's need for companionship. I started bringing my children to visit him, and over time, our bond grew stronger again. About a year ago, my father made the difficult decision to step down from running his company. He transferred control to a trust, something I knew he did reluctantly. He had always been a man who valued his independence and his hard work. But with Mom gone, he had no one to turn to, and his health was failing. Despite our differences, I was still his son, and in his declining years, he seemed to reach out to me once more. Ailing, however, had never really been close to my parents. She was never fond of Mom, who, in her opinion, was overly involved in our lives and constantly nosy. I never understood her discomfort with my parents, but it was something she had made clear from the beginning. She avoided visiting them, citing my mother's behavior as a reason. When Dad threatened to disown me over my refusal to join his business, Ailing became openly critical of my parents, calling them mean and greedy. She argued that they didn't have the right to treat me that way, but I stood firm in my decision. When Dad removed me from his will and decided to donate his wealth to charity, Ailing's criticism grew even more intense. She often told me how unfair it was that my father, rather than supporting me, had turned his back on me. I, however, had already made peace with the situation. I had long ago accepted that my father's money was not going to be part of my life. I didn't need it, but Ailing couldn't understand that. She believed that my father's wealth was something I should be fighting for, and she was adamant that my relationship with him was a lost cause. This tension boiled over when I told her that I would be accompanying Dad to dialysis twice a week. She exploded in anger, accusing me of wasting time on a lost cause. "Your dad's already removed you from his will. Why bother? He's never going to change his mind about you, she said. You're just throwing away your time and energy for nothing. I tried to explain that my father was a human being, not a business investment. I didn't care about his wealth. I cared about him as a person, as my father, who had been there for me in his own way, even if I didn't agree with his choices. He was a proud man, and I had come to realize that he didn't need me to take over his business, but he did need me now more than ever. But Aile couldn't see it that way. She would argue with me every Saturday and Wednesday, coming up with plans that she knew would make it impossible for me to follow through with my commitment to Dad. On Saturdays, when I would normally be accompanying Dad to the dialysis center, Aile would plan family outings, invite friends over, or suggest that we do some major cleaning project in the house. These plans were never flexible, and when I refused to cancel my commitment to Dad, she would lash out at me for being late, selfish, or inconsiderate. Wednesdays were no better. While I had already made arrangements with my boss to leave work early, Aile had her own agenda. She would often go out visiting friends or attending some social event, leaving me to juggle work with the responsibilities of caring for the children. I would rush to pick up my father, take him to dialysis, and then hurry back to complete my work while caring for the children. It was exhausting, and her continued lack of support made things even harder. It wasn't just about the logistics of the situation, either. Aile's comments and constant criticism wore me down. She would tell me that my father didn't deserve my attention, that he had made his choice when he removed me from his will. She seemed to believe that family was a matter of convenience, and that my devotion to my father was misplaced. But for me, it wasn't just about his legacy or his wealth. It was about fulfilling my role as his son, especially in his time of need. Despite everything, I tried to keep the peace. But every week, it became more difficult. My father began noticing how stressed I was, how much I was rushing him around. "Son," he said to me one evening after dialysis, "you don't have to rush like this. I know you have a life of your own." It was true. I had become increasingly impatient with him, rushing him through his appointments and pushing him to get in and out of the car as quickly as possible. It pained me to realize that in my quest to balance work, family, and my duties as a son, I had lost sight of the importance of being present in the moment with my father. I started asking him to let the nurse take him to dialysis instead of me. He agreed, but it didn't sit right with me. I couldn't let go of this responsibility, even though I felt like I was struggling to keep up with everything else in my life. The drive to and from the dialysis center had once been a time for us to talk and connect, but now it was just another rush chore. My father was my family, and despite the conflict with Aile, I could not abandon him. Yet, the strain was becoming unbearable. Things continued to escalate with Aile. The emotional strain from juggling the responsibilities of my job, caring for Dad, and trying to keep a happy home life was becoming unbearable. I was walking a fine line between duty and exhaustion, and yet Aile seemed to be getting more and more distant. It wasn't just her criticisms that wore me down, it was the absence of any real support, any attempt to empathize with my situation. We had always had our differences, but they seemed to grow sharper in the face of my father's deteriorating health. Every time I spent time with Dad, Aile would make veiled comments about how I was neglecting her and the children. I started to feel like I was being torn between two worlds, my obligations to my father and my obligations to my family. But every time I tried to talk to Aile about it, she brushed me off. "You're doing all this for him, but he doesn't care about you. He never has," she would say. It stung, but part of me already knew that Aile didn't truly understand. Her disregard for my commitment to my father was growing more apparent. She resented the time I spent caring for him, resented the late nights I spent working after picking him up from dialysis, and resented the emotional distance that had crept in between us. Aile was always a woman who valued comfort, stability, and routine above all else. But I couldn't give her that anymore, not when my father's health was deteriorating so quickly. I remember one night, I was sitting in the living room with the kids, reading them a bedtime story, when Aile walked in, visibly upset. Her face was drawn, her eyes tired, and there was a certain hardness to her expression. She didn't say anything at first, but I could feel the tension in the air. Finally, after a few minutes of silence, she spoke. "I can't do this anymore. I want a divorce." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I sat there, staring at her, unable to speak for a moment. I had known things weren't perfect between us, but I never imagined it would come to this. "You want a divorce?" I finally asked, my voice quiet, almost disbelieving. "Yes," she replied, her tone cold. "You've changed. You're not the same person I married. It's like I don't even know you anymore. You're always gone, always busy with your father, and the kids, they don't need you like they used to. You're choosing him over me." I felt a sharp pang in my chest, but I didn't argue with her. Deep down, I knew she was right about one thing. I had changed. I wasn't the same man I had been when we first met. My priorities had shifted over the years, and they had shifted again after my mother's death and my father's illness. But I had thought we could navigate this together. I had hoped she would understand. Clearly, she didn't. I didn't want a divorce, but I also didn't want to live in a marriage where I was constantly being made to feel guilty for fulfilling my familial duties. So, after a long and painful conversation, we decided it would be better to separate. I was ready to move on, but the reality of losing my family hit me hard. I still loved Ale, and I was heartbroken about the thought of losing my children. Ale was insistent on the divorce, and I complied without much resistance. I figured if she didn't want to fight for the marriage, then why should I? The decision wasn't easy, but the way she had pushed me away emotionally, coupled with her indifference to my father's situation, left me with little choice. It became clear that she was done, and I wasn't going to beg her to stay. The separation process was surprisingly straightforward. We agreed on a mutual arrangement. Ale said she didn't want any of the assets, no part of the house, no claim to the savings, and no claim on the children. She said she wanted to be free. I found that almost laughable, given how much she had always talked about financial security and stability. But her indifference to everything, her abandonment of me and the children, her refusal to even fight for the kids, stung deeply. It was as if she didn't care for anyone but herself. I don't know why she said she didn't want the children, but she didn't even argue when I said I would keep them with me. My two children, my son Lucas, who is 6, and my daughter Emma, who is 4, had always been my joy, my reason for everything. They were the light of my life. Ale didn't even try to get custody. She signed the papers quickly, without hesitation. It was almost as if she had already emotionally checked out, already written us off. She didn't even try to fight for them, my own children, and I couldn't fathom it. I knew the kids would miss her. But I also knew that I could give them everything they needed, a loving, supportive home, filled with laughter, stability, and the occasional chaos that comes with raising children. When Ale's mother spoke to me, trying to convince me that she had made a huge mistake, I was unmoved. She said that Ale was still very young and couldn't carry the weight of raising the children on her own, that the responsibility was too much for her. I had to hold back my laughter. Fine by me, I told her. I'm glad to have my kids with me. It's a relief, honestly, and that was the truth. I felt a weight lifted off my shoulders. As the divorce proceedings wrapped up, I found myself in a strange place, free from the emotional baggage of my marriage, but burdened with a sense of responsibility to my children. I couldn't help but wonder what had gone wrong. But I didn't dwell on it. I had to focus on the future, on providing for my children, on ensuring they had a happy and fulfilling childhood. I decided to make a change for the better, not just for myself, but for them as well. I moved in with my father. It wasn't the most conventional of solutions, but it worked. Dad's house had always been a place of refuge for me, even when things were tough. After my mother's death, Dad had continued living there alone, but his health had started deteriorating rapidly. I had considered moving back in for a while, but it wasn't until the divorce that I actually took the step. It turned out to be one of the best decisions I could have made. Moving in with Dad was a breath of fresh air for all of us. The kids loved having their grandfather around. They had always been close to him, but now they were able to spend even more time with him. The house, while large, had always felt too empty for just Dad. But with the children there, it was filled with life again, laughter, play, and an energy that hadn't been present for a long time. Dad seemed rejuvenated by their presence. He had always been a strong, stoic man, but with the kids around, I saw a softer side of him. He laughed more, he played with them, and his health seemed to improve, too. He looked forward to the time he spent with Lucas and Emma, and they adored him. I could see the bond growing between them, and it filled me with a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing something right. The decision to move in with my father wasn't just about convenience. It was about giving my children a stable, loving environment, surrounded by family. I knew that Ale had never wanted that, but that was her choice. She had walked away, and I wasn't going to make excuses for her. Having my father's company around helped me as well. It provided some structure, a sense of normalcy in the chaos. He had hired a full-time caregiver to assist him with his daily needs, and I decided to let her help look after the children as well. This arrangement worked out perfectly, as it allowed me to focus on work and my father's care while still being present for my kids. I knew that with the extra support, I could handle everything from managing the household to running my business. In many ways, it felt like a new beginning. For the first time in years, I wasn't constantly juggling multiple responsibilities with little time to breathe. I had my father's support, and I was able to support him in return. The kids thrived in the new environment. And despite all the hardship, I felt like I was finally in control of my life again. I had my children, my father, and my business, everything else could fall into place. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit notification bell to stay updated.